Welcome to this deep dive. We're jumping into a really fascinating stack of sources today. Specifically, we're looking at excerpts from a document called Resilient Disciples Needed.
Right.
And it uses the biblical book of Acts as, well, a lens, really, to understand what following Jesus meant in tough times back then and, crucially, now.
Exactly. And our mission here, you could say, is to unpack what this material reveals.
Yeah.
About the early church, but also their world and how those insights, maybe surprisingly, speak directly to the complexities you might be facing today.
It's definitely a dynamic look at history, sometimes challenging, but incredibly relevant. So let's get into it.
Okay.
The material starts right off by describing the book of Acts itself. It calls it incredibly exciting, compelling, but also disturbing and challenging.
It really is all those things. Acts covers these huge transitions,
Yeah.
like the ushering in of the era of the Spirit after Jesus left.
Right.
But what the source material really hones in on, what it finds fascinating, is that Luke, the author, he didn't sanitize it. He reports the failures, the struggles, the conflicts within the early church, right alongside the amazing triumphs.
So not just a highlight reel then?
No, definitely not. The material stresses that Luke was really grappling with this question. What does it mean to be a resilient disciple? A countercultural one, even in an environment that was, frankly, often toxic, oppressive.
And they talk about Luke himself, his background.
Yeah, they emphasize that. Him being a Gentile doctor, a convert, writing from this place of really intimate fellowship with Jesus and the Spirit.
And this wasn't just dashed off, was it?
Not at all. Our sources paint it as a pretty costly undertaking, carefully researched, meant to be read widely.
So involving scribes, travel?
Exactly. Probably a scribe, yeah. Extensive conversations with key people, Peter, Paul, others maybe. Lots of travel, potentially even joining Paul on some journeys. This was a serious researched account.
Which brings us to the central idea the sources really hammer on: resilience. They say, pretty bluntly, that our world today is, well, hostile for followers of Jesus.
They do state that. And they introduce this really striking idea. To thrive in cultures like that, we need what they call extremophile disciples.
Extremophile disciples. Okay, unpack that. Those life forms that live in extreme conditions, boiling vents, deep sea.
Precisely that analogy. Life forms that thrive where most can't survive. And here's where he gets really interesting, according to the sources.
Yeah.
They argue the early believers, they were these extremophiles. Think about it. Everything was against them. Persecution from outside, disagreements inside. But they didn't just, hang on. They actually thrived. They replicated Jesus' ministry, planted churches, all in these incredibly extreme conditions.
So the idea is what Jesus started on earth didn't end when he ascended.
Not at all.
It continued through these spirit-filled disciples. And Acts is that story.
That's exactly it. Acts is presented as the continuation of Jesus' work from heaven through his people, empowered by his Spirit.
And Jesus gave them a pretty huge vision for that, right? Acts 1:8, witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Starting from a small group, that sounds daunting.
Immensely daunting. But the sources point out how Luke structured the whole book around that expanding vision. He's showing how this seemingly impossible plan actually happened.
How does the material break down that expansion?
Well, it maps it out in phases, geographically, culturally. It starts with the witness in Jerusalem and Judea. It's roughly Acts chapters 3-7.
Okay.
Then you see the shift. Disciple-making expands to Samaritans, to Gentiles.
Right.
That's chapters 8-10.
Right, Cornelius and all that.
Exactly. And then after that, church multiplication really takes off, moving towards the ends of the earth. Chapters 11-20 cover a lot of that.
And the final phase.
The release of multiplying movements. That takes us from Acts 19 through to the end, chapter 28.
Okay, and the source material connects this structure to Jesus' own ministry.
It does, yeah. It suggests this outward ripple mirrors the phases Jesus himself went through with his disciples. Yeah, their preparation, laying foundations, getting them involved, participation, then multiplying leadership through them, and finally launching a movement.
So the disciples lived these phases with Jesus first and then replicated them. Is that the idea?
That's the insight they draw out.
Yeah.
And a really key takeaway the sources emphasize is that these kinds of movements, they're built on sacrifice, on releasing others. They can't just depend on one person.
And there's historical evidence for this kind of impact.
Oh, yeah. The material mentions how by the 4th century, Christianity had grown massively in the Roman Empire, from this tiny persecuted sect to potentially over half the population in some areas by the mid-300s. That kind of growth shows the power of this expanding, multiplying witness they're talking about.
It's easy to think of that Greco-Roman world as just ancient history, totally separate from us. But the sources argue, no, there are some really striking connections, correlations.
They really do. And it makes you think. Take a la carte spirituality.
Okay.
The ancient world was just saturated with gods, right?
Yeah.
A god for practically everything. Temples everywhere, part of everyday life.
And the sources see that mirrored today.
Absolutely. They point to this, well, explosion of spirituality globally. Maybe not always formal temples, but shrines, rituals, different practices. It's everywhere. Few places are truly secular. So the early believers had to figure out sharing Jesus in that kind of spiritually diverse world. And the argument is we face something similar.
Which connects to the next point, right?
Yeah.
Syncretism and pluralism. The early church sharing Jesus in a world full of nymphs, spirits, demons.
Totally. And Luke doesn't shy away from it. His story includes things that sound almost supernatural, like that bonfire in Acts 19.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier, where new believers burned their magic stuff.
Exactly. And the value, our sources quote the text, 50,000 pieces of silver.
Wait, 50,000 just for magic books and charms? That's huge.
It's staggering. It shows a massive investment in what the sources call the dark arts among some of those early converts. And they draw a parallel. Today, you see diviners, exorcists are still a thing in many places. Fascination with spiritual realms in media, New Age stuff.
So that ancient world, with all its spiritual complexity, maybe isn't so alien.
That's the point. They navigated a deeply pluralistic, often supernatural-seeming world. We encounter versions of that today.
Another correlation that really jumped out at me from the sources, the internal conflict, schism within the church. They weren't just this unified bloc against the world. They struggled with racism, nationalism, tribalism, sexism, religious taboos, stuff that threatened to tear them apart.
Huge divisions.
Yeah.
And the sources pose the question directly. So what? What does that mean for us? Because today, let's be honest, the global church is fragmented too.
Yeah.
We see incredibly similar tensions. Migration brings different traditions together, sometimes clashing. Conflicts over lifestyle, culture, worship, theology.
So the specific issues in Acts, things like purity laws, gender roles, who's in and who's out, they're not just historical curiosities. They echo our divisions now.
That's precisely the connection the sources make. Those early struggles for unity and identity, they mirror so many pressures the church faces globally today.
And the last correlation, tough mission environments. The sources contrast the time before Constantine, before 313 AD.
Right, when persecution was often overt.
With the time after his Edict of Tolerance.
Yeah, that edict gave Christianity freedom, legality. But over time, it led to it becoming privileged, dominant, what the sources call Christendom. And that shift changed things fundamentally.
How so?
Well, the sources suggest that when being a Christian was costly, even dangerous, it forged a certain kind of deep resilience. After Constantine, that external pressure lessened, and eventually being Christian became socially advantageous in many places.
But the environment today is different again, they argue.
Very different. In the global north, they talk about post-Christian paganism. Not pre-Christian, but post-Christian, a rejection of something known. Okay? And in the global south, challenges like large numbers who are maybe Christian in name only, plus sometimes resurgent, even brutal forms of Christendom trying to regain control.
So, sharing faith, making disciples, it's actually tougher now in some ways.
That's the argument. In both contexts, it requires that older pre-Constantine kind of resilience. It's tough terrain.
Okay, so given all the challenges, the correlations the sources present, acts as like a field guide, a textbook for ministry in these tough environments today.
That's a good way to put it. A textbook or maybe a blueprint. They break it down into those 5 phases we touched on, arguing they're repeatable for building movements, replicating how Jesus himself made disciples.
Right, let's walk through those again. Phase 1, preparation.
So Luke's intro in Acts reminds readers of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, the time the disciples spent with Jesus, walking with him, learning from him. That was their preparation, their immersive training, you could say.
Makes sense. Then phase 2, foundations.
Pentecost kicks this off dramatically. Geographically, it's based in Jerusalem, Judea, and the sources highlight the explosive growth. Acts 6.7 even mentions a large number of priests becoming obedient. That's significant reaching into the establishment.
But this growth provoked opposition, Stephen's martyrdom.
Yeah, the material calls it a terrible climax. But here's the paradox they point out. His death wasn't the end. It scattered the believers. Yes, Acts 8 makes that clear. But that scattering launched them out. It pushed the mission forward, ironically.
Which leads into phase 3, participation.
Stephen's witness, his story, sort of broke the dam. It paved the way for Jewish Christians accepting others. Samaritans, the Ethiopian official, Saul the persecutor, Cornelius the Gentile.
And this phase directly confronts what the sources called the ugly sin of discrimination.
Had to. The ancient world was deeply divided by ethnicity, status, gender, religious rules. Huge barriers. And the sources point to Barnabas in Antioch.
Acts 11.
Yeah, Acts 11.23, recognizing God's grace on everyone there. That church in Antioch becomes arguably the first truly multicultural church.
And the key was participation, like Jesus telling the disciples to fish for people.
Absolutely crucial. The sources stress this. Every believer was a disciple maker. Not just the apostles. Those scattered believers, ordinary people, shared the news in places like Antioch. Acts 11 says great numbers turned to the Lord because of them.
Wow.
Then Barnabas and Saul come and equip great numbers, intentionally multiplying leaders.
Which flows right into phase 4.
Yeah.
Leadership multiplication.
Exactly. Here you see continued rapid movement growth, but also intensifying opposition. The sources actually draw parallels between Paul's experiences with his teams and Jesus with the 12, suggesting Paul was consciously following Jesus' model of raising up leaders.
And what drove Paul, according to the material? Sacrificial love.
Yes, rooted in a deep, self-giving perspective shaped by the cross. That drove him to relentlessly equip believers, and specifically future leaders. Ephesus is the prime example.
The 2 years there.
Right. 2 years of focused equipping, and Acts 19 says the result was all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word. That's regional impact. An explosive movement launched from that hub.
And finally, phase 5. Movements.
Luke finishes the book following Paul's journey, under arrest, to Rome. And even under house arrest, Acts 28.31 shows him boldly and without hindrance preaching and teaching about Jesus.
But the ending feels abrupt. It just stops.
It does, like Luke's gospel in a way. But the sources argue that's the point. Movements aren't built on one person. Jesus ascended, leaving his spirit. Paul's ministry in Acts concludes with him having equipped others, encouraging that selfless attitude of Christ from Philippians 2.
He was willing to kind of fade out, even be executed as tradition holds.
Because he'd invested in others. He'd released them to carry it on. That's the unfinished narrative the sources talk about, the unwritten Acts 29. And that, they argue, is vital for movement builders today. You have to be willing to release control, to equip others to continue the story.
So wrapping up, the source material essentially says, Acts doesn't have a neat conclusion because we're supposed to be writing the next chapter, Acts 29.
That's the challenge it leaves us with. And it's not about trying to perfectly recreate the first century. It's about moving forward, doing this disciple-making work in our unique, challenging environments. The pagans, the post-Christian, the next Christendom context you find yourself in.
And doing that requires, they say, more than tweaking things, a software upgrade, radical change.
Yeah, not just patches on an old system, but something fundamentally different at the core. A renewed understanding and practice of discipleship itself.
And digging into Acts, understanding those early extremophile disciples, that helps cultivate the resilience we need for today.
That's the idea. It equips us, encourages us, maybe even corrects us as we figure out how to write that next chapter.
So maybe the question to leave everyone with, reflecting on this deep dive, if Acts is this kind of textbook for tough environments, what does writing your part of Acts 29 actually look like, right where you are today?